I'm calling to order the Open Space Board of Trustees meeting of January 13th, 2021. Welcome and thanks to all who are attending or viewing or listening to our first OSBT meeting of the new year. We hope the new year holds many good things for all of us. As usual, for those who are just listening, I will do a roll call. Hal Holstein.
Here.
Karen Holweg.
Here.
Dave Kuntz.
Here.
Caroline Miller.
Present.
And I'm Kurt Brown. So Leah, we have all of the board present. Just a quick agenda preview tonight before we move on. There is no public hearing tonight scheduled. We do have our usual open comment period, which will follow approval of the minutes. So during open comment, you're free to address any issue, whether it's on the agenda tonight or not. And I will at this point ask Allison Eklund to go over the rules for tonight's meetings and to make sure everyone knows the process for signing up to speak. Allison.
Thanks, Kurt. Can you all see that slide?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for joining us tonight. In order to strike a balance between meaningful, transparent engagement and online security, we have these guidelines for our virtual meetings that I'll go over. This meeting has been called to conduct the business of the City of Boulder. Activities that disrupt, delay, or otherwise interfere with the meeting are prohibited. The time for speaking or asking questions may be limited, and no person shall speak except when recognized by the person presiding, and no person shall speak for longer than the time allotted. Each person shall register to speak at the meeting using that person's real name. So if you have logged on to the meeting tonight with Tom's iPad, for example, we would ask that you rename yourself, or you can send a chat with your full first and last name, and I can rename you in order for you to speak. But I cannot unmute you unless we have a full first and last name. No video will be permitted except for city officials, employees, and invited speakers and presenters. All others will participate by voice only. The person presiding at the meeting shall enforce these rules by muting anyone who violates any rule. And the chat function will be enabled to communicate with the host only for technical or Zoom related questions. And only the host and individuals designated by the host will be permitted to share their screen. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And Allison, how many folks do we have signed up at this time?
No one signed up in advance.
Okay, well, we'll check back with you after we go through and do the approval of the minutes. And so that's what we will turn to now, looking at the minutes of December 16th, 2020. Does anyone have any proposed changes or corrections for page 1? And raise your hand. We have 16 squares on my iPad, so you may have to wave like that. Corrections on page 1. Okay, seeing none. We're on page 2. I have I think a correction. This was from Jim McMillan. He was saying he'd like the Open Space Board of Trustees to hold a firm line until water conveyance structures are proven out. And I think that should be groundwater conveyance structures. I think that's what he was referring to. So Leah, that's the next to the last line in the first paragraph, until groundwater conveyance structures are proven out. Other corrections or proposed changes on page 2 from anyone? No? Okay. Go on to page 3. Anything there? No. Okay, Leah did a wonderful job putting together the minutes. Thank you. So now we will do a roll call to approve the minutes from December 16th, 2020. Hal Holstein.
Approved.
Karen Holweg.
Yes.
Dave Kuntz.
Yes.
Caroline Miller.
Yes.
And I, Kurt Brown, vote yes also, so it's unanimously approved. Leah, thank you. So now we would go to our public comment for any items, since we're not having a public hearing, and that includes any item on the agenda, including the Voice and Sight program and ag land use assignment guidelines or any other issue. We always give folks a minute to make sure they've had a chance to sign up here. I will check back in with Allison and see how it looks.
Yep, so if you would like to raise your hand to be called on to speak, I'll call on you in the order that I see the hands. If you go to the participants icon, probably at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and open that participants box, you should have an option at the bottom of that participants box to raise hand feature. So, yep, I see one. So you can raise your hand and lower it in that box. And I did receive a chat from Mike Browning, so he would be up first. And then I have Francis on deck and Tony after that. So let me find Mike.
Okay, Allison, we will assume we're not going to get a whole lot more, so we'll give 3 minutes apiece. Thank you.
Allison,
Sure.
Allison, I usually have a hand raise function, but for some reason tonight on my Zoom thing, I don't. So if,
Yeah, you're a co-host, so you won't be able, you don't have that
Oh,
feature
okay.
because you can do it all yourself.
okay, but if people don't have a hand raise, they can just chat.
They can chat to me. They all should have it since they're just participants and not co-hosts or hosts.
Okay,
And when I unmute you, please just say your first and last name and Leah will start the timer. Let me go back to Mike. Okay, Mike, you should be good to go.
All right, everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Well, good evening, thank you. Yes, my name is Mike Browning. I live in Gleanaway in Southwest Boulder for the last, 35 years. And I've hiked the trails there in sort of the West TSA, certainly every weekend day and a lot of weekdays for the last 30 years. And I want to just make some remarks about the Voice and Sight program. I'm afraid it's broken, at least in terms of maintaining wildlife in the West TSA. We used to walk there, and you'd see deer, you'd see wild turkeys, you'd see Abert squirrels. And now it's a sterile corridor. There is no wildlife to be seen from any of those trails. Even the Abert squirrels have left. And I think a lot of that has to do with the Voice and Sight program. There's a lot of dogs off leash, a lot of dogs out of control. Probably every third or fourth day that I walk over there, I see a dog running wild in the forest with no owner in sight. I have shouted, "Whose dog is this?" And there is no response. And so dogs are just chasing out the wildlife, and people are taking the Voice and Sight program as licensed just to let their dogs do whatever the dog wants to do. It's becoming a dog park, not a wildlife refuge or a place where you can see wildlife. So I think when the Voice and Sight program is reevaluated, you really need to look at doing some restrictions. Things like, if you can't put all dogs on leash, at least make the Voice and Sight requirement that they have to be within 6 feet of the edge of the road or a trail, so they're really under control. And other limitations like that, like nighttime use. We actually, our house is on the beginning of the Greenbrier Trail, and we see high beam headlights from headlamps going out. So the wildlife don't even have a chance to rest and recuperate in the evening. So some sort of nighttime restriction would be good as well. I also never see a ranger out there. In 30 years, I've seen 2 city rangers out. I've never seen a volunteer ranger there. So I think you need to ramp up the volunteer ranger process. If we're going to have rules and regulations that people are expected to follow, they need to see somebody in a uniform who's reminding them of what those rules and regulations are. Otherwise, I think Voice and Sight's turned into a joke practically. So please, next time you look at the Voice and Sight program, think of the wildlife. The West TSA is the only home they have sometimes. And, we can all go back to our homes and pet our dogs, but once a wildlife leave that area, their range is just getting more and more restricted. So we need to do something with the Voice and Sight program to try to not drive off wildlife and encourage wildlife to come back in the West TSA. So that's my spiel. Thank you very much for your service. And I'll end now.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, next up I see Francis Harto and then Tony Ganaway, and that's all for the hands. So Francis, you should be, let's see. Trying to unmute you.
I can unmute myself. Does that work?
There you go. Thanks.
Okay. This is Frances Hartog. I live in Southwest Boulder. And my comments tonight are regarding our unparalleled Voice and Sight program. Boulder is a great place to be a dog. And having helped develop the Voice and Sight program updates while serving as a trustee, I find it gratifying to see the monitoring results do indicate that some aspects of the program are experiencing high compliance. However, our open space is not a great place to be if you're wildlife and it's your only home. The monitoring results show 50% compliance for dogs not harassing wildlife. And even though the monitoring results were low, that 50% compliance is what we daily trail users are seeing, especially in Southwest Boulder and Cheyenne Ridge. Fortunately, there are some easy program tweaks that can make the program more wildlife friendly, and I sent those to the trustees today. For instance, defining the within sight measure as whether or not the dog is in a visitor group is not within the guardian's immediately 360-degree field of view. Excuse me, but I'm not sure who came up with that. You should not have to turn around to see whether your dog's anywhere in sight. First of all, let's require leashes after dark. Require all dogs to be leashed from 1 hour after sundown to 1 hour after sunrise. This would allow wildlife some rest and recovery time. The number of people using the system during dark hours has increased significantly, even before COVID. Not even the best of dog guardians have the ability to see in the dark. And the last thing our wildlife needs is the high beam of dog owner headlamps sweeping their habitat. Second, let's redefine what within sight means. It should be upfront, perhaps 20 degrees to each side of the guardian. Too much damage is being caused by dogs whose guardians turn around only occasionally, if at all, to locate their dogs. Let's extend the on-trail requirements. Require dogs to be kept in a specific distance of the trail, along with being visible at all times. 10 feet would be reasonable. That way, nobody has to guess whether their dog is really under Voice and Sight or not. And lastly, think about a weekend leash rule. With system numbers, use numbers quickly, incredibly increased since COVID and unlikely to go back down, consider requiring all dogs to be leashed on weekends. That way, at least for the weekends, our rules will match other regional open space areas, and our system will be less of a regional magnet for off-leash dogs and their owners. We really have become a magnet because our rules are looser than any place else on the Front Range. And our open space should not have to bear that burden. So please, think about it. It's time to see if it's working or not. Many things are working about the program. The protection of wildlife is not working. So thanks for your time. I appreciate your service.
Thank you, Francis.
And last we have Tony Ganaway. Tony, I'm trying to unmute you. It's not. Let's try over here.
I'm
there we go.
unmuted on my end now. Okay,
Thanks.
We can hear you, Tony.
thank you. First of all, Tony Ganaway, 5438 Omaha Place. I'm a dog owner. As a general comment, there is no part of the Voice and Sight program which is simple. Everything that I've come across on the Voice and Sight has multiple points of view, multiple aspects. There's facts for and against it. I'd just like to comment though on a very personal one. I had a dog. I got a new dog puppy last year. My previous dog was well trained, but he was, he died. And I was training him up to voice and sight standards, and I could train him in the dog park because I'm retired. I can go when it's quiet. It's not a great place to train the dog. But then I had to get him check him against the outdoors, the on-site open space. So to be honest, I thought he was good when we went out there, and for a few occasions, he did not come back as expected. I think I can say that now because now he does. But if a ranger had come past when I was training him, we would probably get a ticket. Now it isn't mentioned in the report that there is supposed to be a place set aside for training dogs for voice and sight. And I know it's not being created because it mentions it in the report as a limitation. So of all the different aspects of voice and sight, I would just like to bring that one to your attention today. I think if people can train their dogs in a real environment, it will improve the adherence to the rules. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Any more people signed up, Allison?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Then we will close the public comment and move on to matters from the department. Dan Burke.
Great. Thank you, Kurt, and Happy New Year, trustees. It's good to be in 2021. We've got a couple of items under matters today, a couple of robust, great items to delve into. First, we're going to discuss some refinements and changes that staff has made to our agricultural land use assignment guidelines. And after that, we will provide an update to the Voice and Sight TAG program and have a discussion on that. But first, with agricultural land use assignment guidelines, we're going to have Andy Pelster present. Andy's our agriculture and water stewardship supervisor. And joining Andy to help field any questions will be John Potter, our resource and stewardship service area manager. So with that, I'll turn things over to Andy.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I'm gonna work on a screen share here. So hopefully people should be seeing a presentation if I've done it correctly. Is that confirmed?
Yep.
All right, great. As a reminder, I am Andy Pelster, the Ag and Water Stewardship Supervisor here at Open Space and Mountain Parks. I'm going to give you an update tonight regarding the agricultural land use assignment guidelines. These guidelines were developed in 2018, and they are intended to be a comprehensive guide for staff and the producers regarding agricultural land use assignments. Previous version of the guidelines were used to make assignments in 2019 and 2020, and we've continued to make improvement to the guidelines and the process over time based on our experience in using the guidelines and from input that we've received from the community. Tonight, I'll take a look at some of the input that we received. We'll discuss the changes to the guidelines and specifically individual guidelines or individual criterion descriptions. There will be some opportunity for you guys to provide feedback at the end of the presentation. In 2020, we provided 2 opportunities for comment in addition to the information we heard in assignment appeals from our spring assignments. And we've used this information to inform the current changes as well as information that we've heard in our day-to-day contact with our existing tenants. A questionnaire was sent to over 40 participants, and an email was sent to 170 interested parties or interested individuals that we keep track of who are interested in leasing open space and mountain parks land. In addition to this targeted outreach to the agricultural community, I also worked with staff from the city attorney's office, city manager's office, the purchasing department, and open space and mountain park staff working on equity, diversity, and inclusion to inform the new criterion that we have developed. The questionnaire included a total of 17 questions, and you board members, you did have this included in your packet for reference. 9 of those questions were multiple choice, and the multiple choice questions asked participants to, or they were focused around satisfaction with the process, outcomes, preparedness, and what was required for proposal submission. In addition to those 9 multiple choice questions, they were also given an opportunity to provide written comment via 8 questions. And that was a good opportunity to provide specific recommendations for changes and improvements. We'll take as we review the input from the questionnaire, the respondents rated the assignment process and the process outcomes as average. This probably makes some sense given that an outcome could be highly supported and also not supported depending on if you agreed or not with that decision. In that particular case, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very good, the average, or 4, the number 4, which is a good rating, was the most highly selected answer when it comes to outcome. So even though the outcome was rated average at number 3, the most selected answer was good. So, we can generally feel pretty good about the outcome of the process. Respondents also indicated that the information presented prepared them to submit a proposal and that the time allowed and the notification that they received were sufficient. Respondents also agreed that the required submittals were reasonable as requested, and neither agreed or disagreed with the criteria that the criteria descriptions clearly describe what we were looking for in the agricultural management proposals. We certainly hope that the clarifications we are proposing to make will help improve this rating. In 2020, there were several appeals, and we heard some concern with the appeal procedures. So we wanted to reaffirm the importance of the ability to appeal and the transparent and belief in the transparency of the process. Respondents of the questionnaire indicated that both of these factors remain of equal importance to participants. As I mentioned, there were also 8 open-ended questions where respondents were given the opportunity to make written comments or suggestions for improvement. This word cloud was created using the written comments and suggestions. You can see some obvious words like farmers, process, properties, very common words you might expect in this kind of input. But you can also see words like criteria, experience, financial, equipment, ability, qualified, evaluation. These things are speaking of words we have in the guidance and things that would influence the individual criterion descriptions. We'll take a closer look at this and more specifically as we address the individual criterion over the next few slides. Up on this screen now is the updated weighted criteria table. We've matched the titles on this table with the titles that are included in the individual criterion guidance. And this greatly simplifies this table. We're also hoping that this will require the proposers to more closely review the provided guidance rather than rely on the summary information that was included in the previous table. You'll also notice that we now have 6 criteria instead of 5. We've added a diversity and inclusion criteria. We've heard that perhaps the historically underserved criteria that we used in previous iterations wasn't quite hitting the mark. You'll also note that the fit of the proposed operation remains the most highly weighted criterion. We've consistently heard that this is important from both the agricultural community and from the general public, as you know, they're all concerned about good stewardship of the open space and mountain parks agricultural lands. I did work with City of Boulder staff, working on equity and diversity and inclusion in regards to the weighting of the criteria that were relevant to those issues. There were a couple of changes that we made to the guidance document in all of the individual criterion descriptions and in the appeal section of the guidance document. We added words like, for example, and a statement of professional judgment to each description. And we did this because management proposals they're often complex, many times are complex, and sometimes contain information that includes scoring guidance that can be interpreted to fit in multiple scoring categories. For example, an operator may have 10 or more years experience, but their proposal, the information they included in their proposal demonstrated lesser knowledge of a best management practice that's important on the property. So ultimately, reviewers use some scoring judgment to assign an appropriate score. In looking at changes and comments that received regarding agricultural experience, it does remain the second highest weighted criterion. We do continue to hear that this is an obvious important rating factor. Some of the comments indicated that they believe it should be more highly rated than it is, as maintaining a successful farming or ranching business over time shows that a proposer can be successful as conditions change. In the guidance in the previous version, more heavily relied on experience within Boulder County, and we've heard concerns with that part of the guidance. In response to that, we've added or in an urban interface other than Boulder County, and this reduces the reliance on local experience, but also satisfies a desire to have farmers and ranchers with experience working within an urban interface. The urban interface presents really unique challenges and opportunities, and those challenges and opportunities certainly require a unique set of skills to be successful. The knowledge of best practices and the operation experience part of the criterion description generally remained unchanged. As I mentioned, the fit of the proposed operation remains the most highly weighted criterion, and reviewers use the information provided in the proposals to evaluate how well what is being proposed meets the management objectives for the property. For example, the property might be identified as a site suitable for local food production, or reviewers are looking for practices that have been successful in improving resource conditions while supporting viable agricultural production. We've added reference to past success with the proposed management practices in hopes that this will help the reviewer score more appropriately, but also provide better guidance or help the proposers provide better information for reviewers to consider. We've also added reference to maintaining or improving soil health, given the recent development and importance of that program within the department and throughout the Boulder Valley. The equipment available to operations, I think, is important to success for obvious reasons. For example, a ditch plow certainly is necessary to maintain irrigation laterals as required in the lease. Some operations that are proposed require unique or specific equipment, and this isn't always available on a wide basis throughout the local agricultural community. We've heard from the community that the guidance regarding custom operations needed modification. In response to that, we've clarified this language in a way we hope meets the needs of the agricultural community. For reference, custom operations are used when a tenant doesn't have the time or the equipment to complete an intended operation on the farm. For example, hay baling or stack hauling, or bale hauling, excuse me, seed drilling. Some of these things that take specialized equipment are often done on a custom basis where they're paying another operation to do that. So we do recognize that there are occasions when custom operations are economically beneficial and justified. And so we hope we've updated the guidelines to reflect this. This was also a category where some respondents indicated that perhaps this is a good item to have, like a checkbox where they indicate that they have all of the equipment necessary. We didn't quite go that far in this iteration, but we hope we have improved it in a way that's meaningful. Demonstrated financial ability is certainly one that can be challenging to assess sometimes from what is submitted in the management proposal, but it is important for an operation to be successful. Operators need to have access to the financial resources to implement the best practices that they have proposed that they were going to implement to us. Again, this was another criterion that was suggested might be a good candidate for a checkbox, where they simply certify that they have the resources necessary. We didn't opt to do that. We opted to added language encouraging proposers to include information of how the proposed operation is going to be profitable for them, so that it gave more information for reviewers to take a look at and hopefully provide better scoring. We also heard from some folks that clarifying or better documentation of the availability of outside resources is important for equity purposes. An example of an outside resource would be access to lines of credit or sources of income from other agriculture related ventures. We often ask questions in the proposal whether this is going to be a cash supported operation or if there's going to be capital or operating loans being taken to support the operation. The current historically underserved producer and access to land criterion replaces the previous small disadvantaged business criterion. This guidelines document has been fully updated to accurately reflect the language used in the USDA guidance relative to underserved producers. We had a little bit of confusion in our last set of guidelines where we actually had some language to programming that had expired at USDA. We've consistently heard that access to land is an important component in the Boulder area for underserved producers. And in fact, that's one way they're underserved. Guidance was added to reflect this. Access to land in the case of these guidelines refers to access to public land resources as part of their existing operation. For example, a producer might or would receive a lower rating here if their operation already includes a headquarters facility or a site identified as a best opportunity area by the agricultural management plan, as these are highly desirable and really quite scarce on the system and in surrounding area. The sixth and new criterion is a diversity and inclusion criterion. We heard that perhaps the underserved producer guidance that we used last year didn't fully capture what is being valued by the local community regarding diversity and inclusion. This criterion gives credit to producers who provided goods or services, mentoring, or have hired members of socially disadvantaged communities, excuse me. Higher ratings will also be awarded for those who exceed pay requirements of the Colorado wage and hour laws. We heard feedback from producers that this guidance may be difficult to achieve given the small profit margins in farming and the competitive nature of the local job market. Workers from all backgrounds in the Boulder Valley can often work for more money, doing much easier work. So it is a challenge for producers to keep a diverse workforce. However, this guidance is important to promote this issue in the local agricultural community. There were several appeals throughout the assignment process in 2020. Appeals will still be made to the director. However, we've given the director the ability to delegate this authority. For example, he may delegate a second staff team to conduct a second evaluation. We're also asking for a succinct description of why the decision was not consistent with the guidelines. And in this version of the guidelines, only the assignment method and the selection or non-selection of a farmer or rancher can be appealed. We had very open appeal guidance in previous versions, and we've restricted this for administrative efficiency, but also heard from the agricultural community that the appeal process as it was could potentially be used by participants to inappropriately impact an assignment's outcome. Appeals at the time, or this year at least, will be accepted via email, given that offices are closed to the public and in-person delivery isn't likely to be available when we do make these land use assignments. So with that, that's a pretty quick overview of the guidelines. Does the board have any feedback they would like us to further consider to improve the guidelines?
Allison, if you can flip us to the matrix view, then we can get hands recognized here.
Andy, if you could just stop sharing your screen, I think that would help us.
There we go. Who has a question for Andy? Yeah, Dave.
Andy, thanks for that. I do think the guidelines are greatly improved, and so thanks to all you guys for working on those. I do have a few questions though, so I'd just like to run through those real quickly.
Sure.
So I don't know if you have the guidelines in front of you, but on page 6 of our packet, on the 5th
Dave, is this the strike-through version or the clean version?
strike-through.
Okay.
On the 5th bullet, it's help existing agricultural operations be successful and promote stewardship if possible. My question is, why is the term if possible used there? Isn't that something that we just want to encourage, period?
Yes, I believe so. Can you restate where that is, Dave?
Yeah, well, in our packet, it's on page 6. It's actually page 1 of the strike-through guidelines.
Under purpose.
Under purpose.
Okay.
So it's the 5th bullet under purpose.
Fourth
Wait,
bullet, I think.
4th bullet. Yeah, 4th bullet. So my question was, why that qualification? That just struck me that we don't need that. That's what we want.
So what you're suggesting is perhaps deleting if possible.
Deleting that.
That makes sense.
And so similarly on the next page, at the top of the page, the 2nd bullet down, making sure that there's a fair competitive access to agricultural opportunities routinely when in the best interest of the city. My question is, aren't all of these actions, aren't we considering them to be in the best interest of the city? Why would they not be in the best interest of the city?
Yeah, good point. I think they certainly are intended to be in the best interest of the city. You know, I
Well,
think,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
as I say, I think the guidelines really are written to be quite comprehensive. So there probably are statements here and there, something like you're pointing out, that certainly the guidelines are meant to be in the best interests of the city. But we also want to make sure that the criteria or the guidelines are working for the agricultural community. So perhaps that's a reason for a distinction in that case.
I think it also suggests that you don't have a conflict of interest as staff.
Oh, in the best interest of the city as opposed to the staff. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
Yeah, it's pretty broad, but I think that's one thing it implies.
So that's fine. My suggestion would be just be to delete the remainder of the sentence starting with routinely. But if there's a good reason to keep it, then that's fine as well.
And Dave, I'm not quite sure exactly where you are here.
So I'm on this. Well, for Andy, it's the second page of the guidelines, but for us, it's
page 7.
It's agenda item 3A, page 8.
It's page 8.
Eight. Okay.
At the top of the page. The second bullet down.
Yeah.
Or just a thought, Dave, if I could jump in on what you're saying. When I look at this under purpose, so we hit the 4th bullet that Dave was talking about with the phrase if possible. If you go down 2 more bullets for the purpose to maintain an agriculture program within city means and staff capacity, perhaps if staff likes what they're saying in the other bullet that Dave was talking about, when in the best interest of the city, maybe looking at putting some of those phrases more condensed into the purpose. So just for example, for that, maintain an agricultural program in the best interest of the city and within the means of staff capacity, something like that.
That sounds fine to me. I'm just suggesting that it's a little confusing to me. So I think your suggestion, Caroline, is a good one, but somehow maybe make it a little simpler and clearer would be my suggestion. And then on that same page, the 4th bullet down, the use of the word corruption, that struck me as a pretty strong term. Are we encountering corruption in our agricultural program?
Absolutely not, Dave. But in the past, there have been suggestions that there could have been favoritism, or, and I think it was just more a perception of that. So we want to, and this has been in here for several years. We wanted to make sure it's perfectly clear that we have very ethical staff who are not in any way practicing any sort of corruption. So
I reacted to this section also when I read it, the ethics and transparency section. I thought, wow, this is really strongly worded and in depth. What does it speak to? Like, have there been huge problems with corruption and all? That was my reaction. And I did ask Andy about it. And he said, no, it was just, like you said, John, to make sure that past accusations were addressed. But I don't know if there's some way to make it sound more positive rather than so.
Well, I do have some suggested language. And that is after the word practices. So practices that are unethical or jeopardize accomplishing the purpose of the city's agricultural program would be my suggestion. So John, I guess I would ask you if that language is sufficient or satisfies the concern. It just struck me that boy, that really leaped out as something that we've really got to pay attention to. And I guess I've not been aware that that's been an issue of any great significance.
Yeah, no, and it has, and just to be real clear, David, it has not been an issue, but it was more when we started down the path of doing these guidelines where in the past we didn't really have anything, that we just wanted to allay any concerns that if one staff person saw somebody else acting in an inappropriate way, that would be brought forward by the others. That's all that this one was trying to get at. But we'll take that. We'll take that suggestion and see what we can do with this moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and then one last thing, it's a question, I guess, to both you, Andy, and John. The December 31st deadline that is actually on page 10 of our document. I'm wondering how you came up with that. And so it just struck me that for a lot of the farmers and ranchers, that they would benefit from knowing, kind of what the anticipated future in the next year looks like earlier, so that they can get their planning done, as soon as they can by the first of the year. So it struck me that December 1st would be a more timely time for that rather than the end of the year. And I'm just wondering if December 31st has any other significance, or whether it was just kind of decided that was a good time.
Right. Well, there's two reasons for, in the old guidelines, we had by December. And in working with some staff regarding equity and inclusion, they recommended that we have a specific date. And in discussing a specific date, most of our leases actually operate on a calendar year basis. And lease language only requires 30 days notice if they're going to terminate their lease. So that would put us getting notice around November 30th or the 1st of December. And we were trying to give an allowance for us to make arrangements to make those announcements.
Have you talked with any of the ranchers or producers about kind of the timing of all of that, how that fits into their work schedules?
Yeah, we have heard that the earlier the better, but also in the input that we received, the time to prepare and the time to be ready for the process seemed to be adequate. But I do hear what you're saying, and we would have to change. Probably the thing to change would be the notice in the leases, so that we're receiving more notice when there's an intent to not renew the lease, and that would allow us to change that date.
Okay, it just strikes me, Andy, that there's a responsibility on the producer's part to kind of respond in a timely manner, as well as our part in making sure that we respond in a timely manner. And it just strikes me that they're probably at the end of the harvest season trying to get ready for the next year, and so it would behoove us to provide whatever information we need as soon as possible.
Yep. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
That's all I had. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Who's next? Karen.
Thanks for all your work on this, Andy.
Sure.
I am especially happy as a Boulder resident and consumer to see this section on diversity and inclusion, and I think that's very well done. The thing that I had a problem with when I was reading this is definitions. And just to make it easier for people to understand what some of these terms really mean, I would encourage you to either put an asterisk or quotes around some of the terms that are specially defined in a government document. So for instance, on agenda item 3A, page 16, where I think the first mention of historically underserved producer is, if that could be in quotes or with an asterisk, so that people know to look up that definition, which the definition means basically non-Anglo. And instead of using a term that's familiar to everybody, or I think more familiar to everybody, like non-Anglo, using historically underserved producer with the definition at the USDA website is fine, as long as people know to go to that website to get the definition and see exactly what it means. And a footnote would be another way to deal with that. Put an asterisk and then in the footnote pull the USDA definition out, because I got all the way to the end and I said, to meet the criteria and be historically underserved and meet the diversity and inclusion criteria, you don't even have to be a person of color. And that's because I missed the historically underserved definition. So that's one suggestion. And that same is true for the term veteran farmer or rancher. It doesn't mean old or experienced, it means a military veteran.
Yes.
So those, I think it's great to use the USDA definition of those terms. I just think it'd be clearer to people if they were called out and defined in some way.
Okay.
And then I'm probably really missing something here, but when I read this sentence in the middle of page 30, I can't make sense of it. I have read it to myself so many times, I'm going crazy. Right in the middle of the middle paragraph on page 30, it says, nothing stated by staff at the mandatory pre-proposal tour, as only the written answers to clarify questions will change the invitation for proposal requirements or content. It seems to me there's a phrase or a word missing in that sentence, or am I just reading it crazy?
Yeah, I know that perhaps a comma there would help.
What is it trying to say? I understand that it's trying to say that nothing stated by staff at the mandatory pre-proposal tour. What?
Right. So we will do a pre-proposal tour of a property, and we'll discuss.
And that's required by everybody, right? Who wants to bid on that?
Yep. So in that meeting, we review the invitation for proposals, and participants in the meeting interested in the property will ask us questions, and we record those questions and record the answers to those, and that becomes the formal record of that meeting. And if we've made an error in the invitation for proposals or something, that written record is the formal record, and somebody can't catch a staff member on the way out and say, what did we say about so-and-so? And use that as the formal record.
Andy, I think if you just insert 2 commas, it will become clearer, and those would be after the word tour. So nothing stated by staff at the mandatory pre-proposal tour, comma, as only the written answers to clarifying questions, comma, will change.
Sure.
Or does it mean except the written answers to clarifying questions?
Well, I don't know about except.
Yeah, yes, it does. Yeah. So it might be a little Dave, along the lines of what you're saying, I think it is that clause that's tripping things up. So
Yeah,
if we move that whole clause to the end of the sentence, I think then it makes it'll
Okay.
flow.
Okay.
Yeah, that
And-
would work
Yeah.
fine.
Thank you.
And-
I'm sorry I had such a hard time with that, but I figured if I didn't understand it, somebody else in the world would not understand it.
For our viewers who are listening, that's kind of an oxymoron. John or Andy, would you read the sentence how you think you're going to rewrite it?
Sure. So it would say, instead, it would say, nothing stated by staff at the mandatory pre-proposal tour will change the invitation for proposals, requirements, or content, comma, as only the written answers to clarifying questions could do that.
Perfect.
Or something like that, yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me stop belaboring that and go over to page 34. In the paragraph at the starting on line 3 of page 34, everything is perfectly clear to me about what the evaluators are supposed to do and what they use to do their job. But the problem that I ran into in that paragraph is that in line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the paragraph, it refers to interviews. And I said, oh, interviews. When do they happen? And it seems to me the first sentence of that paragraph needs to say the proposal evaluation team will evaluate all responsive proposals and may choose to check references, comma, conduct interviews, comma, and or enter discussions and or visit existing properties managed by the proposal so that people know when the interviews are going to occur.
Okay.
Because I didn't see that stated anywhere else, except it says there could be interviews. And that's it.
Let me follow up on that, Karen, and maybe it's just my federal background showing, but it is a rule in federal hiring and also procurement that you never interview one of the proposers. You interview all of them or none. And so I just raised that question, guys.
Right, and we certainly don't just interview one. It usually is a top subset is how we have done it. Maybe four. I think for the baseline complex last year, we did 4 out of 8.
So you go through an initial screening, which has its own process, and then you interview all of the remaining. Okay. Is that stated anywhere in your?
No.
That's not my memory either. Anyway, I just raised it as something to think about.
Yeah, that'd be
So-
good at the beginning of that paragraph too.
We do make a statement that says the evaluation team will only amend ratings and rating sheets for the proposers included in the competitive range subset of proposers.
Okay.
Certainly a good clarification as far as mentioning that.
Yeah, maybe if you can get interviews in there, that would be good too.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Who is next? While we're letting people look at their notes, I'll just ask, I think it's great we're reaching out to people for feedback. Do you guys have any ideas on how we're going to increase our response rate? Are we going to make it a requirement of a lease that they answered our previous questionnaire?
Well, I think, I guess in an ideal scenario, with this group in particular, some type of open house or an in-person meeting, a larger gathering would make the most sense. Unfortunately, with the COVID scenarios this year, we weren't able to do that. We do it a lot in a one-on-one context. We would like to invite further participation in a group setting that works the best for this particular group. But again, we didn't have that luxury this year.
Yeah, no, good point. Thank you. Anything else here before we thank John and Andy for their presentation and all their work here?
I have a question. It's
Yeah, Caroline.
related to
And then I see Hal also. I'll get you next.
when it comes to the applications that are submitted, do you find that the amount of pages that one person will submit varies quite a bit from application to application? So if someone submits a 20-page proposal versus the next person a 40, have you guys encountered that, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we certainly have encountered that. And we have discussed trying to suggest page limits in the invitation for proposals documents that we send out, to try to limit, and hopefully focus the materials that are submitted.
I think that would be a good idea to have suggestions for that. I do recall that the last year or the year before, it was some were 2 pages, some were 40 pages. And to some extent that shows investment and interest, but also, as you know, some producers are just a little bit more facile with, word processors and spreadsheets and things like that. So I think guidance would be useful there. It's a good question, Caroline.
Yeah, I don't want to restrict anyone's creativity or entrepreneurial ability or what they want to let staff know about. But I was just thinking about that and the fairness of it. And perhaps if there was like a template that if someone wanted to create their application in their own way, that's fine. But there's also perhaps a template for those that are a bit lost in the process that just creates a little bit more equality across the board.
Mm-hmm. Good suggestion. Thank you.
Hal.
Yeah, Andy, I really appreciate the great work and all the redlining and everything. I just had two kind of more perception related questions in the criterion matrix.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, is there a reason, even though the fit of proposed operation will have a higher weight, that it's the second criterion? Normally, wouldn't we organize these by most heavily weighted criterion being number one? And you know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point. And really, I am guessing that is a relic going back to when experience was the highest rated factor.
Yep.
And I just haven't switched them in the table, but that is a very good point.
Okay, I think that because I feel like this table will be the first impression that many people who approach the process sort of get of what we value as a department, which leads me to my next question. I sort of understand conceptually, I think, why you're delineating the historically underserved producer and diversity and inclusion. But as a result of that, what we find is that those two criterion show up at the bottom, whereas if they were sort of combined as a single criterion, they'd place in at 15 points and would show halfway up this list. And it's just a difference in perception about how we're valuing these things, but I kind of see them as part and parcel of the same departmental value. And rather than them being down at the bottom of the list, that puts them halfway between. Just something to think about or consider. Those are my main two comments. Otherwise, I think you did an exceptional job here. I really appreciate it. And most importantly, hope it serves the department's needs for the reason you undertook the revision.
Great. Thanks, Hal, for the input. Anything else?
Hal, I had I think it probably, a lot of people that look at that table wonder at first glance, what's the difference between the last two criteria and why aren't they combined? And maybe you guys could just talk for a moment about, why you think it's important to keep them separate. And I think that also addresses Hal's question of how they fall generally to the bottom.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we separated them was really to make it easier for interpretation for reviewers. Some of the items are more clear and some are less clear, but so we tried to write them in a way that helped the reviewers be, the most clear with in how to evaluate them. And we're also doing in having the access to land as part of the underserved community. That kind of separates that one a little bit from inclusion and diversity. So I think those are a couple of reasons, and one reason for us kind of sticking closely with some of the USDA guidance for these is that in cost sharing programs and those kind of things, many of our producers will be encouraged to provide that paperwork or that documentation of that programming if they are going to participate. I don't know, John, if you have other comments.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it. I totally get Hal's point, and maybe there's some way we can group them or somehow show it a little bit differently on that table, though.
Yeah, I think, Hal, we did discuss with purchasing and others throughout the city in regards to the 15%, and that was an important number for us to take a look at to have those issues equal to or up to that in the process.
Okay, anything else for the gentleman?
I think I have one last question, and again, it's not completely on the document, but do we have any farmers currently, or have we ever in the past that received payments to the farmers from the USDA in regards to any farm programs where they were receiving income support for producing key crops?
Yeah, we have in the past. It was probably more common in the past for more commodity type producers to receive income support payments. We still have one or two that I'm aware of that do receive those income support payments. One of them that I am aware of declines them from time to time and only accepts them when absolutely necessary. But we do have some that participate in income support programs.
And is that asked to be revealed on the application?
Not in the application. We do, as the landowner, we have to sign that paperwork from the USDA as the landlord, acknowledging that receipt.
Okay, well, Andy and John, thank you for all the work you've put into this. This is sort of iteration round one, so thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, board, for the very great comments. We really appreciate that.
I appreciate the input and the opportunity to present.
Okay, Dan, I think we're back to you.
Yeah, just a quick opportunity for me to give my thanks to Andy, John, and their staff. Sort of taking something on that you put a lot of work in, and then every year continuing to look at it and refine it. They've all had completely open minds to improving that process. And again, especially after appeals of the last few years, staff has really done a great job of reaching out, keeping open, and keeping that continual improvement sort of mentality. So I really appreciate all the work that went into it, starting early in the summer and for many months. So I think by the comments that you all provided tonight, and it wasn't 4 hours worth of comments, is really testament to the amount of work that they put into it. So I just want to put my thanks out to them as well. All right, so we're going to move on to our second issue under matters, which is an update to the Voice and Sight TAG program and ensuing discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my partner in crime, our Deputy Director, Steve Armstead, who will get things started with this topic. Steve?
Great. You bet. Thanks, Dan. And I'll kick it over in a minute to Lisa Gonzalo, who will present and introduce some other staff too that'll be presenting a majority of the information. But before jump into them, I just wanted to, again, set a little context about why we're talking about this topic tonight. And I think it builds perfectly off of what we just concluded with, is that we've got programs in that we continually do work towards to develop and implement and adapt to. And I think a lot of our conversation tonight reflects that we 6 years ago put in place a lot of changes to the Voice and Sight Tag program after a fairly lengthy evaluation, community engagement, council guidance around changes to the program that was originally visioned in the visitor master plan. And I think, even though there's going to be a lot of good conversation I anticipate tonight, I don't want it to go unsaid about the, I think, substantial and significant effort that staff has put in over those 6 years to implement those changes, which are numerous. And I think they're well captured in the information that was shared in December to help inform this meeting. But there was a lot of hard work. You'll hear from some of those staff tonight, but there are many work groups that were represented. Back in October, you heard from the monitoring, the human dimensions team and the monitoring information. You'll hear from education, you'll hear from the Rangers, but keep in mind, the Voice and Sight Tag program touches many aspects of the department, including even our business services and our front desk and customer service staff. So many have a hand, and frankly, many deserve thanks for the work to make the program what it is. But really the goal tonight too is to really continue the ability for you all, for us, and for the community to understand kind of what the status of the Voice and Sight Tag program is now after implementing and have time implementing many of those enhancements. And that the purpose of really touching base on this is to make sure we're following through with guidance and fulfilling the guidance from originally in the visitor master plan that set us on the course for the tag program, but even more recently to keep in mind and think about how the tag program fits within our guidance from our recent master plan as a tier 2 responsible recreation strategy, our SE5, which kind of keeps in mind that we need to be managing passive recreation activities that require OSMP permits. And so this is a permitted type activity on open space. And even kind of more direct within that strategy, it kind of recognizes that we are in the art of continued, refinement of managing these types of programs. And we should look for ways to continually do refinements to the practices around these programs. So the work that we're doing is certainly in line with that tier 2 strategy. The information, a lot of it we shared last fall, we'll share a lot tonight. There's good conversation. There's probably more to be discussed and learn as we continue to talk about this program, but this will hopefully set a pretty good foundation of information about how the enhanced program is being effective in achieving the goals of the program, and perhaps again outline areas where we might need to still do some work ahead. So with the information tonight, hopefully we'll get a better opportunity to understand, have a chance to talk. I'll come back at the end of the presentation and share a little bit more information. But with that, I will turn it over to Lisa, who will really drive us deep into how we're making headway on the enhancements.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. And thank you, board, for the time to have this discussion with you today. I just want to pull up the presentation and make sure that I have that on your screens correctly. Is that showing up okay for you?
Yes.
Success, great. So what I wanted to do, first of all, was to introduce, sorry, one moment. I unfortunately might need to turn my camera off as my internet can be a tad spotty here at the house. Apologize.
Just curious, is anybody else seeing closed caption?
Yes.
Is that intended?
Not from my end.
Yeah, Lisa, I think you accidentally clicked it. So you might have to turn that off from your end.
Let me stop sharing it and share again. Okay, how's that look? I think I've stopped the closed captions now.
Perfect.
Okay, success. All right, well, thank you, Steve. We're here tonight to present an update on the Voice and Sight Tag program 5 years after the council approved enhancements took effect in 2015. And to begin, I'd just like to introduce the presenters we have with us tonight. So again, my name is Lisa Gonzalo. I've been with the city for 10 years, 7 years as an open space ranger, and now as a recreation coordinator. Burton Stoner's with us tonight, ranger manager, and we're presenting the enforcement section, and Casey Breeze is an education outreach coordinator and will speak to the Voice and Sight education class. Also with us tonight to answer your questions after the presentation is Dion Vanderwoody, Human Dimensions Supervisor, Colin Leslie, Human Dimensions Coordinator, Cole Moffitt, Budget Analyst, and Adam Gaylord, Recreation Stewardship Supervisor. The topics we intend to cover today will include a background on the program, as well as individual topics such as registration, education, enforcement, monitoring, and anticipated next steps. So in 2005, the TAG program was included in the OSMP Visitor Master Plan as a trial program to increase awareness of the requirements of voice and sight control and proper dog management etiquette. 1 year later, in 2006, the Green Tag program was implemented as a management strategy, which required guardians to watch a short educational video on the requirements and expectations of having a dog off leash in designated areas, purchase a green voice and sight tag, and have it visibly displayed on the dog. To gauge the success of implementing these measures, compliance monitoring was scheduled for completion in 2006, 2007, and 2010. In their March 2011 meeting, City Council identified and prioritized several overarching issues concerning the long-term sustainability of open spaces, natural resources, and a review and revision of the TAG program was identified as a priority. City Council identified 2 key issues. Number 1, that rates of dog-related conflict did not decrease. And number 2, dog guardians need to improve their ability to use voice commands to control their dogs. Under the direction of City Council, OSMP, in collaboration with the OSBT, revised the TAG program goals and objectives to improve focus on these 2 issues. The revised goal stated that the Voice and Sight Tag program will increase the proportion of dog guardians visiting OSMP who have control over their dogs as required by applicable regulations, including a safe, high-quality visitor experience for all and the conservation of natural resources. The proposed compliance standard from the Visitor Master Plan was 90%, and the overall compliance rate in 2014 was 67%. To achieve this goal, City Council approved 6 enhancements that went into effect in 2015. The first one was an education outreach strategy with 16 actions outlined in detail in the December OSBT written update. These included things like improving clarity and information on signs, providing more focused ranger patrol, and increasing education outreach both online and in person. The second goal was to increase fines for violations. The next 4 goals were largely administrative and included the need for City of Boulder residents to purchase a dog license. Everyone was required to provide proof of current rabies vaccination, attendance of a voice and sight education class, and there was an update to the fees based on residency. One of the biggest impacts these administrative changes had was that participants for the first time had to renew annually, which meant that everyone had to renew at the same time every year, and that the tag color had to change every year as well. Prior to 2019, the city was using an in-house database called DogWorks to administer the tags. This database wasn't sustainable over time. And in 2018, the City of Boulder Animal Protection Unit, at that time, the administrator of both the city dog license and the voice and sight tag, elected to use DocuPet, a dog licensing company, to process dog licenses. In 2019, it was then extended to include voice and sight tag administration. So in 2019, DocuPet accomplished the basic structure to register someone, which means beginning with the person registering with DocuPet itself and fulfilling the education requirement, and then establishing their residency to determine the next steps with needing a license for City of Boulder residents or providing proof of a current rabies vaccination. Throughout the 2019 registration process, DocuPet and OSMP staff documented the errors we were seeing in order to address them in 2020. When COVID-19 hit in the spring of 2020, our OSMP office closed, and the need to have a functioning and customer-friendly online registration process became even more important. These improvements included copy clarifications, or essentially making the language on the website and the DocuPet platform clear and easy to understand from point A to point B. We also integrated the education codes, whereas before the education class was in a separate platform and participants were required to complete multiple steps to provide proof they completed the education course. The codes had now been brought into DocuPet, decreasing these steps. Lastly, and perhaps the biggest area for improvement, we're addressing the fulfillment errors. Things like errors in identifying a customer's residency and prompting outside of Boulder residents to purchase a city license. Fees were also more complicated after the enhancements in that they were based on a variety of factors, including residency, the number of dogs, the number of additional guardians, and the renewal date. Feedback we've received about the registration experience from 2019 to 2020 has been a recognition of a much more streamlined approach and appreciation for an improved experience, but there are still a few lingering fulfillment errors that we're currently working to address. And we found that a lot of participants are electing to bypass the online registration process and simply purchase their tags over the phone. Something that we are aware of and continuing to monitor and evaluate it to improve for 2021. What we saw in terms of registration was a leveling out of the total number of participants and tags purchased in 2019 in comparison to previous years. And part of that was because the old system allowed one person to register their household, whereas DocuPet required each individual to have an email address and a DocuPet login for security and communication reasons. In 2020, we worked to adopt the household system once again, and the numbers reflect the change with an increase in both the total number of participants and the number of tags sold. Interestingly as well, we see for the first time in 2020 that there are more tags than participants. Residency has remained pretty consistent over time, and what I found interesting was that roughly 90% of program participants reside within Boulder County. This is also incentivized through the fee structure in that City of Boulder residents pay only $13 for a tag, Boulder County residents pay $33, and outside of Boulder County residents pay $75. With that, I'd like to introduce Casey, who will now speak about the Voice and Sight education class. Casey?
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, I am Casey Brees. I've been an education outreach coordinator with OSMP for 5 years, and I'll give a brief overview of the Voice and Sight education program this evening. Next slide, please. The education program was created to provide dog guardians with a way to legally participate in the Voice and Sight program. The course content was designed and is continuously updated to ensure participants understand the regulations and expectations of them as dog guardians. The materials presented by the education team are informed by management and enforcement challenges, with the objective of promoting ownership of program goals and encouraging responsible recreation to minimize resource impacts. Next slide. The education component of the Voice and Sight program was conceived from the visitor master plan requirement for the green tag. In addition to updates and signage, OSMP created a short video for participants to watch before legally obtaining a tag. In 2014, OSMP revised the green tag video and incorporated it into an hour-long in-person course to satisfy the enhanced program requirements for dog guardians to attend a presentation every 5 years. This was paired with an annual renewal of the tag, sign updates, and additional information to our website and other visitor resources, as Lisa just mentioned. In 2019, OSMP developed a 5-year online refresher course to streamline the process of requalifying dog guardians whose eligibility would expire. The course purposely integrated the in-person content in a virtual platform, ensuring participants receive the most up-to-date program information. In 2020, due to COVID restrictions, OSMP adapted the online course to accommodate first-time participants. Next slide. Both course structures have their costs and benefits. Most notably for the in-person course, it is more personable and it allows participants to have their questions and concerns addressed immediately. However, this format requires staff time as each class is taught by 2 instructors, each teaching 1/2 of the course. One person checks in participants and submits attendance while the other begins class on time. In addition to a more interactive and timely course, scheduling 2 instructors ensures staff safety as classes are delivered during non-office hours. The online course requires participants to not only show up, but they must stay actively engaged throughout. Questions must be answered correctly before progressing, and all modules must be fulfilled before participants are able to verify completion. The virtual platform is more accessible to a community with varying personal schedules, but regardless of our attempt to incorporate affability, it does not quite meet the personable quality that the live course does. Staff will continue to monitor survey feedback along with these findings and use this information to determine whether we return to in-person courses post-COVID or remain online. Next slide. Thanks. Currently, we do not have a method for differentiating between new participants or those taking the course as their 5-year refresher. However, outside of the renewal window, online course numbers followed in-person class attendance trends from 2016 through 2019. Therefore, an estimated 1,300 took the online course as first-time participants in 2020. Combined with in-person attendance, this is an 11% decrease in newcomers from 2019. Overall, the program has graduated nearly 20,000 dog guardians, and as we saw earlier, about 8,700 of those are currently registered in the program. Next slide. Immediately following the in-person class, participants receive a survey via email. In total, about 10,000 people have received that survey, and the response rate is 26%. This question indicates that 77% of participants agree that the class improved their understanding of program requirements. And thus far, the online course survey is on track with these results. Next slide. The online course survey was distributed to all 2020 course participants in December. Subsequent surveys are being emailed to participants within 1 week of course completion. And as of today, 3,020 surveys have been sent out with a 15% response rate. This question was originally posed with the Likert scale of never to always, with over 75% respondents choosing sometimes to always, for the possibility of fines or penalties affecting how they manage their off-leash dog. We wanted to know the motivations behind these answers, so it was revised for the online course survey, and that's what you see here. And so far, the results indicate that fines and penalties do not actually affect the majority of people and how they manage their dogs, because they believe in and they're confident in how they manage their off-leash dogs. Interestingly, another 34% reported that fines and penalties affect them regardless of how confident they are in dog management because of the financial burden that they impose. Next slide. One of the most frequent comments emerging from the online course survey and through other channels of communication has been an appreciation for continuing the program through COVID and allowing first-time participants to satisfy that education requirement online. So far, we've seen significant preference for the online course over the in-person course, specifically in reference to the level of engagement that's required for the virtual platform. And there have been several requests for the 5-year refresher course to be abbreviated. And as was true for the in-person course, several people feel the education course in general needs to be shortened. And with that, I'll send it back to Lisa.
Actually, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thanks, Casey, for that. Hi, good evening. I'm Burton Stoner, Ranger Manager and longtime Ranger for the department. I'll have a chance to share some summons numbers with you shortly, but just wanted to really acknowledge that that is just a piece of the story of what is going on out there. And so the reason we will be sharing those numbers is those are the best, most consistent numbers that I have to share with you. But really what I wanted to remind everybody is that the Rangers that you encounter out there, they are prepared to provide a whole range of services to the public. And that includes being prepared for a wildland fire incident, a medical issue, a search and rescue issue, providing an education program in addition. And just so as we go on patrol, those are the things that we're prepared to deal and manage throughout our day. Our goal is to interact with as many people as we can, so we do our best to remain spread out across the system, to cover as much ground as we can, and to see as much as of the system as we can on a daily basis, and interact with as many people as we can. I list those other things just because they do come into play in significant ways, and so we may have an incident occur that then draws a large number of our rangers that are in service over to that. Related to the Voice and Sight Tag program, and as we go about our business on the trails and what we're looking for, our main goal is awareness of what it means to be able to manage your dog on city open space and mountain parks, not punishment. And so that takes a great deal of skill, tact, and time and knowledge. And so even though those other things take away or are complicated in how they need our attention, I believe that our system is best served by a ranger naturalist that has all of those skills and brings those to the conversation. Because what we want to do is we want to talk to people when we encounter them with their dog about those interactions with other people and with this place and the biodiversity that exists here. So that's our goal. Build awareness consistently throughout the system. Next slide. So the whole story really is, there are some limitations to our reporting mechanisms, and I just want to be really upfront about those things, because we know it and we are working on it. We went down the road to try and develop a new records management system and got pretty far, and then got it really we were thwarted. And so you see that comment at the bottom about a need for a new management system. Good news is we do have a new digital patrol log that'll be coming online here in March, and it's an Esri-based product called Quick Capture. So I think in the future we're really going to be able to show the whole story about the number of warnings and contacts that we make about the issues, and I think they are substantial and impact the number of people that we can show that we've engaged with. So. So we have issues showing the locations of the violations. We wanted to talk a bit about when the numbers fluctuate, it is associated with the number of rangers that we have on staff. It's changed over the years pretty considerably, and happy to report that we are fully staffed with 19 full-time rangers and 4 seasonal rangers. Again, the summons numbers don't really get to what we're seeing in the field. And so I'm happy to take any questions at the end of this as well. The disposition that is listed there, just to say that, yep, somebody was perhaps issued a summons, but that doesn't say that what happened in the court system as an outcome of that contact. So just want to list all those. We're working on that whole story for you. Next slide. All right. So here's the numbers that we have from 2014 to 2020. We've got them broken down on this table for you by the categories of the different types of issues related to dog management. And the first one, the dog running at large, just want to mention that would include things like not being on leash where it's required, whether that's seasonally or on an on-leash trail. And then the different components of voice and sight control would also be included there, like they have too many dogs per one person, or not a leash with them, and those kinds of things. So the different tenets of voice and sight control. The second column is just the tag itself. So do you have a tag if you're off leash in those areas where that's allowed, permitted? And then aggressive animal prohibited gets to physical contact with a person or another dog, you can see that those numbers have remained relatively low given the volume of use that we have, and that is a good thing. I would say that most of the significant bites, scratch, those kinds of things do get reported to us. The next column is the removal of excrement. That one is really tricky. You can see that those numbers are very low. And I'll just be honest, in order to really influence that, that would take people staying in one spot for a really long period of time as a ranger. And that's just not an efficient or effective way for us to patrol, or really possible in most days. So the other thing is that I would say that the presence of a ranger when we're seen by others on the trail could have an impact on whether the excrement's picked up or not. The other was dogs prohibited. So in areas where dogs were not allowed, those are the ticket numbers in those areas. And then failure to protect wildlife is a direct impact to wildlife that's witnessed by a ranger. You can see a large fluctuation in numbers. We'll get to the kind of the 2020 data on the next slides, but some of those higher numbers again are in 18 and 19 are related to the number of full-time and seasonal rangers that we have on staff. Next slide. Okay, so another way to look at it, just in comparison to all of the kinds of different kinds of tickets that we write, summons, you can see there the main two components of voice and sight control, and their total in relation to all of the other types of summons that we issue. The caveat, so you can see the percentage of how those two things relate to each other. Excuse me. In 2020, COVID affected everything, including law enforcement countywide. And I really want to make sure that I call that out, is that in those first at least 6 weeks, if not a bit longer, there was general agreement among law enforcement to really reduce those kinds of encounters, to take the stress off of people unless there was a really significant issue to work through. So we did put things on hold unless there was really egregious situations. So that would definitely have the impact. The other thing that happened in 2020 was a significantly severe wildfire season, as you all know. And so relative to that, an additional patrol on Flagstaff became a big focused patrol area for us. And so encountering those kinds of issues up there related to smoking, marijuana use, and littering and those kinds of things, as we address those things, that drove up those other ticket numbers. Next. And that's just a simple graphic display of that same information for you. Next.
Great, thank you, Burton. Just wanted to wrap up with monitoring results that we had reported from our Human Dimensions team. So Human Dimensions completed 3 monitoring cycles in 2014, 2016, and 2018. The monitoring program consisted of several different monitoring measures associated with dog management on OSMP lands. These included interactions on voice and sight designated trails, compliance with carrying a leash on person for voice and sight trails, which occurred in 2014 only, compliance on leash required trails, compliance on seasonal leash required trails, and also the on-off leash ratios on voice and sight designated trails, which only occurred in 2018. Those results were presented in greater detail at the November OSBT meeting, but I want to speak to some of the key findings from that report. Whereas compliance in 2014 was 67%, the report showed 84% compliance in 2018. One thing to note is the majority of the non-compliance is attributed to tag display and not a non-compliant behavior. It showed that on trails where dogs were allowed to be under voice and sight control, 40% of them were on leash, and 17% of those dogs that were on leash had a voice and sight tag. Where there are areas for improvement was a 56% compliance rate with the seasonal leash trails. These areas, like the Gregory Canyon Trail, transitioned from voice and sight to on leash for the protection of bears from August 15th to November 1st. One other area of low compliance was a 50% compliance rate when wildlife or livestock were present. And one thing to note here is that throughout the 3 monitoring cycles, there were only 19 total observations. These monitoring results provide us with a great baseline data set and generally what we expect to encounter on any given day on our system. What will benefit us in the future will be to conduct more focused research to better understand low compliance areas like the seasonal leash and wildlife encounters. Looking ahead at 2021 and in line with the Tier 2 Master Plan Strategy RRSE5, staff will build on the work that's already been accomplished over the past 5 years to implement the council approved enhancements. We'll continue to focus on this topic. Some of these topics already identified in the 2020 work plan include additional education and outreach opportunities, building a dog ambassador program, how we can more accurately track penalties for repeat offenders, building a ranger database, continuing to improve DocuPet and the customer service experience, and developing strategies for increasing compliance in areas identified in the 2018 monitoring report. And with that, we'll pass it back to Steve, who will talk about anticipated next steps.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, Burton, Casey, appreciate all that information. And just in wrapping up the presentation, just wanted to kind of indicate where we are intending to kind of go next with this conversation. And as we pulled together a lot of the information, we realized one other piece of information, just as we continue to think about the progress and where kind of the current status of the system is related to voice and sight, is it'd probably be helpful to share out with the completion of plans such as the North TSA plan, the recently approved Gun Barrel ISP, the integrated site plan, and any other kind of changes that are already approved in a plan, but yet have not yet been implemented on the ground. It's probably good to, the staff wanted to share out kind of information so that you understood kind of what the system may look like after those changes have been implemented. So that's information we plan to share out yet within the first quarter here, so in the next couple of months. And then later in late spring, early summer, our intent is to come back and share and discuss with the board the potential actions, adaptive management actions around the TAG program that we are either currently in the work plan or expecting to put in our work plan that are consistent with the approved plan and policy guidance we're currently working under. Any of the actions that are already been called out that we can still move forward, that Lisa covered some of those from the enhanced program, as well as to, in light of looking at what we've completed with the monitoring, think about if there are specific focused monitoring areas or focuses for our monitoring program that we want to be pursuing. So those are some areas where staff will be in the coming months looking at information, certainly gleaning information from conversation tonight and moving forward and bringing back to the boards some of our recommendations and with an opportunity for discussion around those. With regards to what happens with ideas that are kind of not within current plan or policy guidance, how might those be wrestled with? And these are certainly things that staff is listening to. We do want to kind of recognize that with actions that may require modification of policy guidance, modification of a plan, that those are things before we really move forward with taking action or even further consideration of them. That's something we want to make sure we're looking at a number of factors, such as consistency with master plan guidance, thinking about what needs to be best accomplished in the context of a broader integrated comprehensive visitor use management planning process that also has the appropriate level of community engagement to get input around a complexity of different issues and how they fit across our system. Certainly too, there's likelihood on many of the issues, we want to make sure before we move into a policy conversation that we've got council support for pursuing or looking into a policy change. So, and then kind of not last to be considered is the fact that anything we pursue also needs to fit within our ongoing work planning processes to ensure that we have the adequate funding and staff resources to be able to pursue things that we need to invest time and money in to be able to accomplish. So those type of considerations certainly, we're keeping mind of, but there may be, future processes that are the right steps to integrate that thinking into those processes. I know in the coming months, staff is currently working on an approach to sequence out the major planning processes that were called for in the master plan. So that could include something like an update to the visitor use master plan or visitor master plan. And with that information, it may give some indication of when we may be able to, pursue some of the broader context or policy modification interests that might relate to the Voice and Sight Tag program. I think the thing as we get into answering questions and as we get into a discussion tonight, just know that staff is listening to the ideas that come forward from this. We'll be certainly capturing both those that align with current policy guidance and be factoring into the information that we'll continue to assess and be sharing back. We'll certainly listen and hearing ideas that may, need policy changes or guidance, and we'll make sure those are captured for future discussion. And also we want to be mindful and certainly are listening to ideas that might relate to where we need to focus our monitoring efforts moving forward as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kurt and the board for questions. And we have, again, I think Lisa mentioned a number of different staff, kind of the subject matter experts that can answer questions unrelated to any aspect of this program. So.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to all the staff that have come tonight to present all of this. I got to say that every program that Open Space does had to go through a lot of adjustments this year, but I am really impressed with the changes that the Voice and Sight group had to make on the fly to go virtual and online and everything else. It is really remarkable. So folks, why don't raise your hands if you got questions and ask Steve, and he can be the air traffic controller to turn your question over to a particular staff. Yeah, Hal.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, everybody. It was really helpful. I thought your point about excrement was really interesting. It's one of the things that people approach me as a trustee most often about, that they witness and see in the form of bags left on the trail. Of course, most people who leave them there say, oh yeah, I'm going to come back and pick them up sort of on my way back, which ends up not happening, etc. And I fully respect that enforceability is the absolute most critical part of any decent policy. Otherwise, it's more hopefulness. I've done a lot of thinking about that. No immediate solutions obviously come to mind. One thing that I do feel pretty strongly about is that when someone is walking a dog on leash, the likelihood of them cleaning up after their dog is significantly higher because the animal is leashed to them. Other people can witness their presence, and if the dog stops to use the bathroom, so to speak, that's a visible process. And so social pressure makes it happen more. Whereas a dog off leash often might be using the bathroom quickly in the grass behind a tree. It's much easier for people to justify not leaving the trail to go out there to pick up after the dogs. I don't really have as much any specific ideas or solutions, but I just think that we need to be thinking on the wildlife side, particularly zone by zone, and practicality of enforcement. I think Voice and Sight fundamentally has some unenforceable elements. And so my personal view, and I'm really curious to hear what the other trustees sort of bake this all down to be, is that we need to think more clearly about which zones have very unique wildlife concerns that might need some additional protection, and different trails like that. and basically thinking more in terms of on-leash management in areas where we think the enforcement needs to be high, and then also identifying some places where we don't think the enforcement needs to be high, to focus more on voice and sight. I just think that voice and sight will never arrive at the department's goals for enforceability. And that's kind of the big question that we have here.
Bert, if you don't mind, I'm going to amend quickly. I think Lisa's going to be the best air traffic controller because she's the closest one to this topic, and then she can kind of farm out to the subject matter experts, and I'm here to get in as I can. So I'll defer
Okay,
to
Steve, thanks.
Lisa to kind of help direct where we want to have staff respond to the comments.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Hal. I think we all see the program and see its complexities, especially from an enforcement standpoint. And you brought up several points. I'll do my best to try to address some of those. The first one is that dog feces and immediate removal is actually part of a larger dog management umbrella. While it is have implications for voice and sight, what we found in a Leave No Trace study, I believe it was in 2013, was that there was 11% compliance difference between a dog that was on leash and the owner picking it up after them versus a dog that was off leash. I do think that there is some education that we can do around feces removal. And you mentioned kind of social pressures in that I think it's deemed almost acceptable activity to bag the feces and leave it at the beginning of the trailhead with that thought that I'll circle back, I'll pick it up. And what the Boulder Revised Code actually states is that you're responsible for immediate removal, whether that means you pack it with you or you pick it up and you put it in the trash can immediately. And that's something that I think we can improve on through just further education and clarifying that it's not great to leave your poop bag for a lot of reasons on the side of the trail. You had a couple of other points there, so I was taking notes. So I think you mentioned zones for additional protection that we would consider to be on leash. Were you thinking about using our existing management zones for those, or did you have a specific zone in mind?
I do have a couple zones in mind. I think it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but more the point I wanted to say is I don't see the wildlife concerns as being reconcilable with voice and sight. I see that as wishful thinking. And so if there is a place where there is legitimate wildlife concerns, I think we do need to lean towards that which we're succeeding at enforcing.
Got it. Okay, thank you for that.
Hey, Lisa, actually just, sorry, you said something really interesting there. One idea related to the permitting that jumped into my mind, sort of like rock climbers or skiers and increasingly, outdoor recreators are carrying modules with which to remove their own feces as human beings. Do you think there is any possibility that we could, as part of permit issuance, require the presentation of a sealable vessel that the owner plans to use and be carrying with them to put because they don't put the bag in their own stuff for obvious reasons. It's because they haven't thought through and prepared how they're going to actually put that in their backpack in a way that's not going to ruin their own life. Is that something that you guys have thought about at all?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of great inexpensive options for dog guardians to use that you can clip to the dog leash, you can clip it to your dog. And obviously I think smell is probably a large deterrent for most folks to carry that with you. And so, yeah, a little bit more promotion on how we can encourage increased compliance with packing it out, I think could do a lot of good.
But what about the idea of a specific requirement for new permit issuance for people to show that they own at least a vessel for that?
It's something we could definitely consider. It would be one more nuance to an already complicated program, but if we're finding that it's necessary, we also have those participants who don't hike with their dog off leash. And so considerations for how we would include that community as well would be a factor, but not something that we would rule out.
Yeah, I think it deserves a little thought because I'm very convinced by Burton's point that we will never be able to actually bring those numbers up or police effectively.
Karen, you're muted.
I just want to add to Hal's comment before we move on. It's not just your sense or your idea, but the people who participated in the classes themselves said that the part that was most difficult for them to manage, this is self-reporting, was interactions with wildlife. So the dog guardians or substitute guardians or whatever you call them when they don't own the dog, themselves say that the thing that's most difficult for them to manage is interactions with wildlife. So they know that's the point in which they have the least control.
And Lisa, if I could jump in as well, you know, one of the concerns I have on the data that we're seeing so far is actually the absence of any wildlife monitoring results. And it seems to me that a lot of our information is anthropocentric or you know, human visitor oriented, when in fact the extent and magnitude of the impact is actually on, you know, the natural environment, wildlife and the vegetation for that matter. And I'm just concerned. I think we're overlooking the Arby's phenomenon, is that we have the meat, we have the data. And I'm afraid now that what we're going to be doing is actually documenting the disappearance of wildlife. And you know, that's a big concern of mine. And I think it fits in with what Hal was talking about as well, is that, you know, we've got to be paying more attention about the impacts on the natural environment, you know, from our use. And we know that dogs have a specific and major impact on wildlife and ecosystems. And I think along with the comments we received tonight, you know, a lot of us who have been here a long time do agree that we're just seeing less and less wildlife out there. And Burton's right, and Hal's right, the enforcement capability is just not going to be there under the current conditions. And so we've got to be looking, I think, very carefully at how we need to move ahead with this program and what the impacts are from some of those decisions.
Who's next? Caroline.
Yeah, just to colloquy a little bit off of what Dave and Hal said. You know, everyone loves their dogs, and I think that the recreation aspect of this program was something that perhaps initially seemed like a good idea, but I think that as OSBT, you know, our main goal really should be to provide programs that produce environmentally beneficial results. And it just seems that a lot of this program has many components that are doing the opposite of that. So just kind of looking at the purpose of our open space and how this really is aligned with that. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, everyone. It was very good.
Who wants to be next?
Kurt, could I jump back
Yeah,
in?
you bet, Dave.
Burton, I just wanted to ask you, you know, we've wrestled, or Open Space Mountain Parks Department has wrestled with the database issue for a long time. And it's always been perplexing to me. You know, the police department, I think, uses a data system, obviously, in its activities. Is there not any compatibility between some of these, you know, currently used databases and what we actually need to have on the ground?
I'll take a quick stab at it. So there's some compatibility. The problem is, Dave, is we are a square piece that's trying to go into a round hole. And when it comes to other databases, so what we've found out really is that every land management agency has created their own database, and so we still are using the same incident database that you were familiar with when you were there. So as far as recording of our actual incidents, and what I was alluding to is we went down that road with the police department, and their level of the way that they capture information really just was way more than what it was worth for us to be invested in that product. And so that's why we're sort of restarting actually on that side of things, but do know that we recognize that issue, and we're able to get this phone-based app. So we'll be moving to that here in March, and we'll have that information. Previously, it was all on paper, and it's inconsistent and a lot of just human error if you're trying to get, when you're trying to provide data like that. So it's all anecdotal from Rangers' experience. Really, when you talk about, is there a ratio for every summons you write, is there a number of warning, when people tend to think about it that way, and there's so much variability.
I think the board will be very interested in updates and reports on how effectively that data system is working in the future.
I am looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'll bet.
I'll just give a couple sort of theoretical thoughts here and let you guys react to them. And I have some experience in big adaptive management programs, and so I know how difficult they can be to do. All adaptive management programs monitor, but it is an extremely rare adaptive management program that has defined for each thing it's monitoring what the action levels are. That if we get to this level, we're going to take this action. Usually those are completely undefined, and so we do a lot of monitoring, but we don't really know what to do with the monitoring, which means we're probably monitoring a lot of things that we're never going to do anything with, and maybe we're not monitoring stuff we should be, like wildlife. So trying to get a balance where you're focused on monitoring the most critical things, and you have some agreement ahead of time, politically, technically, on what the trigger levels will be on each of those factors that you're monitoring, so that political decision makers, the public, is sort of bought in that this is an adaptive management program, and if we hit this level, we're going to do this. That's really hard to do, but I'd love to get your reaction just about where we are in terms of reaching sort of that very mature level of an adaptive management program.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kurt. I think Colin and Leslie, our Human Dimensions coordinator, will probably speak best to that one. Colin, if you can jump on.
Yeah, so let me just make sure I understand the question clearly. So,
and I'm not sure there was a question. I just rambled for a while.
Sort of the question of, are we looking in the right places, or are we just continuing to sort of monitor generalized conditions? Is that sort of?
Well, and do you have guidance? I mean, as I say, all adaptive management programs have monitoring. Very few of them have action levels defined for all of the things they're monitoring. And that requires a political agreement with decision makers like council and the public. But it says, we're serious about the monitoring. And if we fall below this trigger point, we're going to do A, B, or C. That's sort of a compact with the public and the users. And it has a lot of value. It's challenging to build that understanding, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about where you feel you are and where you feel we need to get to in terms of building, that sort of complete adaptive management framework.
Sure. Yeah, I think we touched on this briefly a few months back when I presented the results of the monitoring report, and just with the evolution from the visitor master plan, I think we started in a place where we knew that there were a lot of variables that we were interested in. We didn't really know which ones would fall out as being most common or of highest occurrence on the system. I think we're starting to get a better understanding of that now in terms of what things happen frequently across a lot of our system, what things are more localized to certain contexts, such as potentially wildlife interactions. At the moment, we don't yet have definitive thresholds identified for a lot of those, but I think that is sort of the next logical place to begin going. To the point about, sort of understanding the ecological context of all of this too, that's an area that we can begin to understand, that we should begin to look at. So if we're talking about triggers and thresholds, oftentimes we tend to look for where we know the problems and the interactions are occurring, but we need to understand if that same sort of signal of impact is also being seen or not seen in areas where there's a different context. So in this case, what natural resource responses are we seeing in areas where we do have certain visitation conditions, and are we seeing or not seeing those in the context where visitation is different, so that we can better understand where some of those thresholds should maybe be.
If you don't mind, I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Darren.
Hi, Darren Wagner, Planning Design Supervisor. I apologize, my 2-year-old is right here with me, so if you hear her, that's I just wanted to mention, Colin, it was a great response, and Kurt, such an astute question. I think that we have tried that here at OSMP in sort of more micro scales. For example, at the Springbrook Loop, I think what you're describing in terms of developing the sort of general understanding, both among staff and community, around what that requires in terms of establishing those thresholds is also can be said in terms of following through on those agreements. We are in similar positions here where, as to say, for example, in the National Park Service context where I've worked before, where, leadership is changing, boards, councils, et cetera. And so the agreements made one year may be, differently interpreted or followed through in another year, another term. So certainly something that we're aware of, and I know there's staff desire to establish more clarity around those things to at least support or facilitate the conversations. And if you remember, within the master plan process, just as it relates to visitor use management writ large, we did say that, for example, as it relates to whether we want to establish those thresholds, was going to be the first part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
To come, it's definitely on our radar.
I think as we go through the rest of this iteration, I think it is maybe something to think about, looking at the areas that seems to be the most problematic, where the biggest conflicts are, to start that conversation with council to say, look, we're hearing a lot of concerns about these things. We set a goal to get to here. Our feeling is we'd like council's input on whether we should establish an action level, that if we fall below that or we don't achieve our goal, then we want your concurrence that these are the sorts of activities or actions that would be taken, just so that we're getting council looking ahead a little bit and the public looking ahead. Anyway, thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate it.
And Kurt, I may just add too, is I think, as we also know, and kind of that complexity is that sometimes what you want to achieve and maybe a desired standard may be challenging to figure out the right monitoring measures and right questions to get there. And I think we've learned a lot through what monitoring we have done, but maybe in this time frame moving forward too, we have an opportunity, as we're talking about, where do we need to focus our monitoring? We can do some pilot efforts or make sure we know we can deliver with the monitoring to get the results that are going to help inform, are we there yet or not? So I think that's the other piece that we can often say, oh, this is a great thing. We should, strive for this goal. Let's try to achieve it. But the monitoring and the data you deliver really has to kind of be based upon a firm this is what we're looking at, and in a firm measure way to measure that too, to know you're there.
Right. We don't want to set goals we don't know how to measure. I think that's a really good point, Steve. And Karen, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, and I would like to continue this conversation that we are at now, and I focused on a specific example or two, because some of us have been at this for decades. And in 2005, 15 years ago, we set a standard, a compliance standard of 90% for the dog behaviors that we defined. We've gone through an adaptive management process in those 15 years. And as staff so well described, in 2014, made a major decision to have, as Steve describes them, enhancements, and spent literally millions of dollars on education, enforcement, and all the complexities that staff has described for us. We know from the data that we have gathered that instead of being at 90% compliance on seasonal voice and sight / leash trails, which are the kind of trails I think Hal was describing in the beginning, they have known wildlife values and known ecologically important habitat, whether it's for bears or for grassland nesting birds. And we initially said, so for those trails, let me just pick out, I think Gregory Canyon and Big Blue Stem are two examples where it's seasonal voice and sight, seasonal on leash because of the wildlife values. And we know that compliance, we've monitored there, and we know compliance is only in the 50–60% range. That's a long way from 90%. And I don't think for any of the behaviors that we've spent so much money and so much time and effort on in the last 6 years, we've been able to pull up any behaviors to the degree that they're 30–40% better. So my question is, are we really going to take another 5 or 10 years to say, well, we just didn't try enough. We just didn't define it well enough. We need to restart, and we need to do the kinds of definition that Kurt has just described, which I think is really the ideal. But are there some things that we know are just so out of reach and so impossible to achieve that we need to do some adaptive management that's more appropriate, given, as Hal says, the values of the system and protecting those natural resource values in the face of non-compliant voice and sight behaviors, and stop the impact on grassland nesting birds or the impacts on bear populations. And I see that Hal wants to add something, so I'm going to stop and let him jump in.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you're saying there, Karen. For me, one of my fears on this is that if we allow this to be very data-driven, the political piece of it becomes more of a morass. For example, Lisa, with all due respect, that 11% figure about compliance of voice and sight versus leashed, I find surprising. It may well be true, but it doesn't align well with my own, personal experience of watching. And so I worry if we get into data, we go there. I want to toss out an alternative, different approach, and I think it really wouldn't work well during COVID, which is unfortunate. But I think a study session where we brought each individual zone map out and started from the standpoint is there any obvious areas where an interesting change might occur and that is politically reasonable or possible, that won't feel like an immense loss to certain people, that includes the dog owning community in that conversation, would be better than trying to say, well, we've got a zone here that's not reaching compliance concerns. I'm going to make one, I said I wasn't going to go there, but I'm going to give one specific example of one where I think there might be this kind of thing. I'm looking at Buckingham Park. And Buckingham Park is an on-leash area by the river, and the trails are on leash. And then you have Yoder, the Yoder Ranch Trail coming up over the foothill, which is on leash. And then there is a Voice and Sight section of trail on the backside of Yoder, which also happens to be where I see all the black bears in Boulder, Colorado. And it's an example of one where I don't actually think that it's a trail that people are highly attached to, like, oh, I go up to the top and back from here, Voice and Sight. And so, I do think there are places where there can be consensus, where we could then approach council with maybe a plan of action that had buy-in from multiple stakeholders that achieved some specific wildlife goals. So I just offer that as an alternative, different approach for a next phase on this.
So Hal, I'm going to jump in here, Lisa, just because I think you gave a couple things. One is one example that maybe helps reiterate why I think our next kind of information coming back to the board is going to be helpful. Because the example you shared is kind of going to be an area that is going to be changed by implementation of the North TSA. That whole area becomes an HCA, so that the Joder Trail and every activity has to stay on trail. That undesignated trail that over on the Buckingham property side actually will not allow access because it is not a formal trail. And again, one of the complexities though, and having said that, is with the implementation of the North TSA, Joder Trail, which is currently leash, will become a Voice and Sight on corridor trail. And I say that knowing that there were a lot of different decision points throughout the entirety of the North TSA that put in more conservative measures to protect resources in certain areas and allowed other activities, some changes in Voice and Sight, or where dogs are allowed in other areas. And so an example there is North Sky Trail has a no dog period to it during the spring and allows dogs only on leash. The whole HCA, in fact, doesn't allow off-trail permits at all. So by default, which is unique for an HCA, is all activity has to stay on trail. So I'm saying this in the sense that we'll see that little bit of that picture, but the other aspect is it may be an exercise we can do, but I think the other part reality is if we do that exercise, one of the things we might find is with past practices, with looking at through the visitor master plan, the TSA plans, there's already been a lot of community involved, past board and even council level kind of scrutiny and thinking about how the system fits together for all the various opportunities. And the reality is that we live now with a lot of that complexity. But I think it might be something we look at, but that's where suddenly it triggers us into looking at a much more broader planning context, because there's kind of decision-making in our past that leads up to what we've kind of have now and where the dog management opportunities sit on the ground. So that's where I think if we kind of choose to start looking at one area quickly, we start pulling at some strings and we realize they lead to all these other decision-making, or, now we're revisiting the guidance that's already part of an approved plan. And that's where it becomes pretty complex. And I think that's one of the things we're thinking that's probably a really interesting and valuable effort, but it's also probably likely to be something that we do as part of a more comprehensive process to kind of take a look at, again, across the sweep of our system and maybe say, let's make sure this works and makes sense given the full range of what we're looking at.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I have to ask, just out of total curiosity, are you saying the trail that's from Old Stage up the backside to Yoder is undesignated and is not going to?
Let me clarify. There's the connection from Old Stage that connects into Joder Trail. That is designated, but there's a trail that kind of goes due north off of there.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking about the main connector is Voice and Sight, and it's like a little section of Voice and Sight between an on leash and then an on leash. Anyway, you see my point.
I do. Yep, and merits the point of, and I think this is one of the things Lisa constantly harps on, is one of the things we can really help ourselves is we've got a complex enough system. It's hard for sometimes people to be, even if they want to be compliant because of the shifting regulations you may encounter across our system. And that's something I think, really does merit when we take another look across the system. We've been taking through TSA's partial looks. At some point, we do have to, and it would behoove us to take that more complete look. And that may also help us factor in and kind of keep in mind where are those areas most sensitive to resources, and thinking about our area management framework and how does that again provide guidance relative to the different dog management opportunities and specific relative to voice and sight opportunities too.
But Steve, I want to revisit how some of the areas that I was referring to came about, and that you mentioned to Lisa are just kind of disjunct. Though in the negotiations in the West TSA, the agreements on the various on and off leash rules for the big blue stem area.
Yep.
It came when people said, no, you can't put that on leash all the time. And we said, okay, it'll be on leash during nesting season when we're protecting ground nesting birds. And the people who wanted it to be voice and sight said, okay, that makes sense, we'll do it. And clearly it doesn't work. So in my mind, that's a classic example of going back to adaptive management and saying, okay, we tried the more relaxed, less rules approach. It didn't work. We need to shift gears and go to something that's more constrained to protect the resource, which is why we made it seasonally on leash to begin with.
And Karen, I think that's something, I'll let Lisa speak to this too, because I know she's been thinking about it, but I think we recognize from the monitoring results as you're picking up, that's an area of improvement for sure, or something we need to be paying attention to. So I think one of the things we can keep in mind as we talk about this, are there certain things that staff may be able to activate that would help improve compliance, and so we may have a time frame to try to put in place some of those. And then maybe that's even something too, we want to continue to focus some monitoring around to see if there are any adaptive actions or actions we can take, what's the results of those that may inform us then again down the road when we start looking at a broader, again, across the system, we have even better information. We've tried these specific actions, and are we at a place where we need to revisit that whole concept and think about it across the system? So that may be one way we can work between now, and what we can fit into our work plan and actions we can take that within policy, and where that may set us up for better decision making, in the years to come.
Okay, so when you refer to policy and guidance and those terms, are you saying that adaptive management cannot be done on those trail segments short of going through a whole new round of policy decisions?
I would probably
just trying to clarify what you're thinking in your
Sure.
head is necessary.
Yeah, that's fair. No, I think if we wanted to try to say, let's revisit kind of all the locations or, what the whole concept around seasonal voice and sight and leash on leash required trails or areas, that many of those are codified in the TSA plans or in the plans there. And so it would be in essence trying to revisit the decision making, because as you noted, like with the big blue stem, there were, compromises about, okay, let's make this certain area given opportunity for voice and sight, but knowing we've got to protect the grassland nesting birds and the grassland resources in this area too. And in fact, as you know, big blue stem's even more complicated with the weekend leash and voice and sight too. So,
and I can tell you exactly how that came about, but I won't worry.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think
the whole weekend.
I do think it becomes challenging for us to kind of just say, okay, let's just look at this one aspect of the seasonal leash and do away with it or change it outside of a broader context. I do think, though, we might have, and that's part of some of the thinking staff will be doing, and we welcome thoughts from the community on the board, certainly, of are there things we can take action on too now that might make a difference there? And that's an area we should focus on because of that low compliance.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking when you say that?
Well, I'll turn it over to Lisa a little bit, but just I know some thinking around signage is something that they're thinking about. So, and Lisa, maybe if you can share any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion. Just for some broader context on seasonal leash and seasonal voice and sight, it's actually, so that applies to the Gregory Canyon Trail, Skunk Canyon, and Dowdy Draw. And so over time, after these decisions have been made, we've actually seen the Skunk Canyon Trail rerouted up out of the drainage. And so, you know, it bears weight to say, should we look at that again and see if it even makes sense to have a seasonal leash? And then when you look at Dowdy, the 2013 flood that went through there had a significant impact on the vegetation and the plants that were attractive to bears at that time. So as time goes on past these plans, and you look at the whole suite of information, I do think that it bears another look to say, you know, are our actions needed? If they are, then let's figure out ways that we can improve compliance in those areas, and let's figure out ways that we can better understand what are the deterrents to why people don't seem to be leashing their dogs during certain times of the year. And in terms of the broader suite of the West TSA, looking at the CCG and the conversations that I wasn't privileged to join, I think some of the context has gotten lost over time. And so those hard-fought battles, when we look at Upper Big Blue Stem having a difference in days of the week, we look at the Homestead Bridge, that's a 20-foot section in a riparian area that's leashed that we see low compliance. Those sorts of things, I think, lose context to the casual visitor coming to the park who wants a good experience and doesn't want to have to keep looking at signs to change their behavior as they need to, but then also to protect those areas, like Hal mentioned, that we really do need to protect our habitat there. So there's a broad suite of context to all of these things that we want to be aware of and sensitive to, with the understanding that we do want to try to make strides where we can in 2021, as much as we can, I suppose.
Yeah, I just have to react to the signage issue. In December, I participated in an hour-and-a-half long Managing Public Lands for Recreation and Wildlife webinar, and I don't know whether there was staff on that webinar as well, but the researchers that presented there basically said, you know, signs don't cut it. You got to have real people out there. And I would very much like to have some representatives from the Indian Peaks Wilderness Group, volunteers who have been working for decades to deal with dogs in Indian Peaks on leash, and have them present to the board. And perhaps it's in this study session that Hal is suggesting. Have them present what they've done, how they've done it, and what their data shows over time, because I think we've got to get very serious about real people out on the trails and stop depending on signage, which there's a lot of data about signage.
I agree. And, you know, given all of the other, you know, a pandemic, there's a lot of competition for what the most important message that we're trying to convey to the community.
I understand, but we've been at this for 15 years with signage, and we got to stop.
No, I definitely appreciate that. Thanks, Karen.
I just want to springboard off of what Steve was saying, and it did make me think that we have a program that we're adaptively managing, but it doesn't seem like we have a lot of tools. And I'm wondering if we need somehow in this next iteration to get agreement from council that there's a basket of things that we would be allowed to try in different locations that don't require going back and revisiting a TSA or system-wide policy, and allow us to more flexibly try out some things in locations that may, where it might really benefit from some changes. So I just sort of raise that as a general question. It's a fairly constrained adaptive management program if you've got to go through a 2-year TSA to change anything. Yeah, I think you know what I'm saying, Steve.
That's a great idea, Kurt.
And Steve, you're muted. There you go.
No, thanks. I think that's maybe something we can look into, and one of those approaches to say, okay, that also would mirror with, let's do some focused monitoring associated with certain, things we're trying to pilot out to see how they do they get to a better place where still maintaining a good experience, but delivering kind of the overall goals too from a resource protection standpoint. So
yeah,
it's okay. Very.
And when you say
I think it's worth exploring.
And when you say good experience, it's got to be a good experience for the 2/3 of the people who don't have dogs too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Experience for all. I'm not saying experience to the dog guardians there. I wasn't trying to be that specific, Karen.
Thanks.
Other thoughts, folks?
I have a couple of specific questions for Burton. Under the voice and sight, this is under the dog-related summonses tables. There are a couple of real aberrations here, and I'm thinking that Burton has some ideas. In 2019, there was a big influx in dogs running at large and in voice and sight evidence tag required in terms of summons. And there was also an increase in 2020 in terms of dogs prohibited, a doubling of those summons. There must be something, Burton, that you have to say about that. Anything.
It's tricky. In 2020, there was definitely, as people were investigating other areas to try and get away from other people, I will say that we definitely noticed that. So they were taking their dogs with them, into some of those areas. So that's a piece of it. You think about upper areas of Flagstaff and some of the HCA areas out east. So I think that probably gets to that piece. The other influx, increasing visitation plays into that, but not that would show that dramatic of a jump,
18 and 19 just really jumped.
Yeah, what you're seeing there too, honestly, it does play into the number of staff, and just a recognition of that, and not just an actual number of staff, but fully trained rangers that are not in the process. So I'll just say we had a lot of movement of rangers in and out of the department, and what it takes to train a ranger is significant, and it also requires a training officer. So now you've got 2 rangers in the same spot doing for a while, for a set period of time, 14 weeks. So those things do change our numbers significantly. And that's why I'm so happy to be where we are at the moment.
I'm wondering if it has anything to do with the end of the 5-year time period, and whether the 5-year time period is too long before re-education.
Boy, Lisa, what do you think? Oh, you're muted.
I had it happen at least once this meeting. So if the summons numbers were a reflection that people perhaps needed a refresher on the expectations of voice and sight. Yeah.
Maybe the right interval is 3 years instead of 5 years, and then we wouldn't have a bounce up in those last 2 years. I don't know. I'm just asking.
Yeah, I think we don't have any evidence to show that that's the case. I do think that the staffing numbers is probably more closely related to that. But there's nothing to say that that's not the case either. So.
It's a
Anyone
huge,
else?
just for a couple more rangers.
Yeah. Karen, did you have more?
What I'm wondering is, in response to the people who spoke during public comment and the concerns about areas like Shanahan, where there's so many dogs off leash, is there any kind of a more focused ranger effort that could be deployed? And the reason why I ask that is, it used to be that on, oh shoot, what's it called? South of El Dorado Springs, where you go up and around the big no dog loop.
The Goshawk Loop.
Thank you, the Goshawk Loop I'm thinking of. There was a really concerted ranger effort there maybe 5-8 years ago, and it really turned around dog and dog guardian behaviors. And I'm wondering if that kind of thing is still done and possible, Burton.
So it is done. It's done in shorter segments though, Karen, to be honest. And so we're able to maintain that kind of focused effort for a while. And it is one of the benefits to our seasonal program, seasonal ranger program, is that we are able to get more people out more quickly onto the system that can help with those efforts. So something to consider. Again, it's not something that's really sustainable, but for long periods of time, but it is something that does have an impact, and we can certainly do that.
I would just add, given that a lot of the visitation to an area like Shanahan is by people in the neighborhood who are there 3 or 4 times a week, I do think a week's worth of intensive education and enforcement will reach an awful lot of people. So I don't think it does have to be, a month long. I think a week's effort would, in several areas, probably would pay off a lot of dividends.
Thanks, Kurt.
Other thoughts, folks?
Yeah, for me, just one kind of closing comment. There's without going into one's own system secrets, there are a couple places on this system where you still can go for a hike with a very high likelihood of seeing excellent wildlife, coyotes, bears, deer. And the one thing I really do notice is that as far as the predictability of a quality experience for all users, right now in the West TSA proper, that is like the Flatirons and the Mesa below, there really actually isn't a single place where one can go have a predictable experience that's going to be dominated by wildlife as opposed to people. And of course, when you go to a no dogs loop, which is very rare on the system, you end up getting lower human usership, which also dramatically benefits the wildlife. So that's why I'm a fan of us taking up some pieces of this again, to make sure somewhere below the foothills in the Flatirons, there is a predictable experience for those who don't want to see dogs, who do want to see wildlife. And the fact that that will turn some people off isn't necessarily such a bad thing, because Lord knows there's a lot of mileage of voice and sight trail in there. And so I hope we'll get to this study session. I hope we can discuss that. Certainly on the North TSA, there's a lot of wildlife value that I think needs to continue to be protected. I know it's politically difficult, but I really do believe, Lisa, in this concept of once we get out of COVID quarantine, if we can get various stakeholders in the room, I think there's the possibility to come to an agreement that will be politically feasible on something like that. So that's my final comment.
Thank you, Hal. Anyone else? Closing remarks, Karen?
Hear from the board members who have not spoken to the question of a study session. I've I'm clearly in favor of Hal's suggestion. What about the rest of you?
I like the idea.
I just feel it's really important it's in person. I'll mention that. I don't think this work can be done on Zoom.
So you're going to vaccinate everybody first, and then we'll have the study session.
Well, I'll be ready next month.
Well, now you're just showing off.
These early vaxxers.
Yeah, right.
Well, I certainly agree with Hal that this is a topic that's always really significant in the public's mind. And so a study session would be worthwhile. It'd be nice to be able to do it in person. Other thoughts? Again, thanks to staff. This is such a manifold issue and of such importance. We appreciate everyone that's involved in implementing it, education of the public, collection of data, analysis, everything else. So thank you. And I know we'll see you all again soon.
Just in parting comment too. I think
yes, thanks, Steve.
Yeah, one of the changes certainly we've accomplished in the last couple of years is just actually creating the position and having someone like Lisa take on a role to give us a point person in the organization, that knowing things like recreation, things like voice and sight permeate so many different aspects of what the department does. But it really is important to have someone with kind of the eyes on and trying to make sure everything's coming together, or to where there's important needs is to keep some focus and marshal the resources, the staff coordination, and to have a point in contact around that. And so voice is one example. There's others that I know Lisa's going to be managing, but that's one thing too the department has recognized in the past, where it's been more diffuse through the department, that sometimes creates gaps. And we're in a programmatic area that I think helps us move this whole conversation forward too, and brings expertise.
Yes, when everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge.
Yeah.
So Lisa, good luck to you and thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you all.
We're going to change you to God title or something.
Whoa, 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 too much. Too much.
Czar, dog voice and sight czar.
Okay.
Dan, are we back to you?
Yeah, we're back to me for just one verbal update. Not a lot of verbal updates tonight, since basically a 2-week holiday period sort of sandwiched the board meetings, and we had a late board meeting in March or in December. So not a lot of verbal updates to report, other than I think most of you know, but if there's anyone listening in, we got bumped at council meeting on January 5th, in which staff was to present the upstream analysis and to convey, and Kurt, you hung out with us. Kurt was to convey the board feedback. We now do have a rescheduled date for that, with a promise that we won't be bumped again. That is the February 6th or February 2nd council meeting. So Kurt, if you're not available, let me know. Otherwise, I assume that we will all regroup and try it again.
I'm putting it in my calendar for 6 o'clock.
I was going to ask if you got a better time next time.
We got news. We were getting bumped well after 11. So
yeah, and that's the way it goes. I learned a lot about Macy's.
Yeah. So Kurt, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Boy, we're going to set a record for a fast meeting here. This is matters from the board. Folks, raise your hand if there's a topic you want to raise or address. And I see 2. So Hal, tell me the topic and let me just put it down here.
A brief comment on environmental mitigation in Sioux South.
Okay, and Karen?
I have some questions about both the Greenway information packet and the parking study.
Okay. Any others, folks? Raise your hand. Seeing none, I'm going to go to Hal first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kurt. I just wanted to take a moment to address the other trustees on something I've been speaking with staff a little bit about via email. I think, we reached ultimately good conclusions in the upstream analysis. recently completed. But from my personal point of view, it wasn't a fully completed project because we still don't have an inventory of the regulatory multipliers for environmental mitigation across all relevant agencies. And conceptually, what that means is, even if we know how many acres a given flood mitigation program takes up or will displace or will develop on, it means we fundamentally can't know what the total environmental mitigation footprint would look like. I think the results of the upstream analysis were so clear in many ways that that wasn't necessarily required, but it still bothers me that we arrived at what I thought is really kind of an incomplete final analysis of acreage. So I have been really encouraging staff to put that inventory of regulatory multipliers together for us so that at some point in the next couple months, we'll be able to really talk about what the result of the dam being moved from CDOT row potentially onto our property will require in new previously unforeseen mitigation. And so I just wanted to let you know that this is something I'm hot on and I feel is very important to our real understanding of these decisions.
Dan, do you want to provide any thoughts on that?
Could I ask an allied question first?
Okay.
On our tentative calendar, it shows that something about CU South is scheduled for February 10th. I don't know what that is, but if you could address that at the same time, that would be helpful.
Yeah, John, do you want to hop in? Otherwise, I could try, but.
Sure. Yeah. So to first to Hal's point. So yeah, staff understands what you're looking for, and we'll put some thought to that and be able to bring some information back to the board when we next meet on this topic. I think that we had a placeholder in the calendar to your question, Karen. I'm not sure we'll have anything substantive to bring forward at that meeting. That's why it was kind of there as a tentative item. But as soon as we do have something on either the flood project or the annexation to bring forward, it might be more like March or April. We'll schedule it onto the agenda.
Okay. Obviously a topic of continuing interest to everyone. Karen, did you want to ask about the Greenway?
I do. In the packet, there's reference to a memo that went to City Council January 5th, which I read with great interest because I don't think the Open Space Board of Trustees has heard anything about this project since they started the soil tests.
Long time.
Long time. And yet in that memo, it says that there were 2 deadline decision-making points in 2020. And I don't think we heard anything about that. And they said that there was very little public participation. And I'm saying to myself, well, if you don't let the public know, you get very little public participation, I think. So I'm wondering, and at council meeting last night, it was clear that council hasn't been notified or involved in anything because they talked about both the stewardship committee and the wildlife refuge Greenway Trail Committee. And the council representative said, you know, those committees aren't functioning, aren't working, so we might as well drop off of them. So I'm wondering whether OSMP staff knows anything about what's going on and who's been involved, because it certainly hasn't been council and it certainly hasn't been OSBT. While I'm pleased with the soil test results for the culvert under 128. The soil test results for the Indiana path of the Greenway Trail are not nearly as good news. So anyway, that's my stream of consciousness thinking about the Greenways program. And I'd just sort of like to know if anybody knows what's going on.
I see that Mark Gershman has unmuted himself.
And he's got a new background. He's not up in
Yeah.
Europe with the Northern Lights anymore.
Yeah. And
No,
Mark,
I'm
before I turn it over to you, just a little context is, so as you know, there was about a year or two period where soil sampling, maybe even longer than that, was being done, and everything was sort of put on hold.
Right.
As results kind of came in, which was late quarter four, we as a staff, quarter simple, and the first thing we decided to do with Mark's kind of experience with the subject matter throughout time is to ask Mark if he could play a point person for the OSMP aspect of the trail. And so in the past 5 to 6 weeks only, we've sort of have regrouped because things seem to be moving again. And Mark has graciously agreed to step in to be our point person and to help work with other regional staff and to help get board and council re-informed on the background of the project, as well as also to inform on next steps. So just with that, with a little context, I think I'll just turn it over to Mark, see if he has more
Thanks,
to
Dan.
add to that.
And Karen, you raised a couple of points. I think the first thing you mentioned, the fact that there were, I don't think there were really there were 2 public hearings held, or public meetings held, I should say, excuse me, because our commitment was to ensure that the sampling and analysis plan that was developed for the soil sampling had an opportunity for broad community input. We had one meeting at offices in the town of city of Westminster, and another at the East Boulder Community Center.
Yeah, and I think a couple of us were at the East Boulder library meeting.
The East Boulder Community Center, yeah. We didn't have a meeting at the Meadows Branch Library. We were at the East Boulder Community Center, and because of the sensitivity of anything having to do with Rocky Flats, we wanted to make sure that there was plenty of opportunity for public comment. So between the 2 meetings, we had about 90 people show up. Jefferson County, who's been the sponsor of this, hosted an online opportunity for engagement. We had close to 400 comments come in on that. The majority, many of them, I should say, had to do with folks who just wanted to see opportunities for recreation. There were others who spoke directly to the technical details in the sampling and analysis plan for the soil testing that council directed us to undertake as a condition of our participation. So those meetings resulted in modifications to the draft sampling and analysis plan. And then we finalized that sampling and analysis plan and moved forward with that sampling and analysis. During that period, the city and county of Broomfield had some additional requirements. They wanted to do some sampling at depth. They wanted to increase the numbers of samples in some of the surrounding areas. So they took on that responsibility. Meanwhile, a parallel project was underway with the same consultant to sample on the areas to be disturbed by trail development on the refuge itself. And then the Jefferson Parkway Authority was involved in doing some soil sampling, again, using the same consultants and methodologies. We had requests from members of the community to split the samples taken by our consultants so they could do independent analyses of these. And we also used 2 different methods for doing the analyses of activity of radionuclides because new technologies had been developed since the protocols had been developed, had been used at Rocky Flats that we were comparing to. So that's why it took a while to pull together this information. There were also a couple of lawsuits involved in there, members of the community seeking to stop the opening of the refuge. et cetera. We did a little update back in, it looks like it's July 11th of 2018, just updating folks on the open houses that we had for the sampling and analysis plan. But you're right, it's been pretty quiet, and as Dan indicated, we're now at the point where we're looking to move forward on additional agreements with Jefferson County and the partners, which are Boulder County, the cities of Westminster and Arvada and Jefferson County, and to apply or to demonstrate our commitment to the grant that has been awarded by the Federal Land Access Program, a branch or a program within the Federal Highways Administration. And so what we wanted to do is just check in with council. They gave us some marching orders in a resolution back in 2016, some work that Darren Wagner kind of did as her first project on board with open space. To get us to that point, we feel we would just want to know where things stand from kind of a policy direction standpoint with council, whether they are comfortable with us advancing the work that we were instructed to do back in 2016, make sure they have an opportunity to get their questions answered in either matters from the city manager or a study session later this winter, and then move forward with the direction that they've provided. I think your other question, yeah, and so the bottom line is we feel that in addition to the resolution, council passed a set of response guidelines. We think we've addressed all of the items in those response guidelines, which also took a little bit of time. So we think that we're ready to advance this project. We're certainly interested in making sure that our other partners are continuing their commitment. When we started this project, Broomfield wasn't involved. They became involved soon after council gave us our direction, or soon after we prepared our materials to go to council. They kind of joined in there. Recently, they decided to drop out of the project out of concerns associated with Rocky Flats issues and soil contamination that they weren't comfortable with. And it has no impact on our financial commitment to see Broomfield leave the partnership for City of Boulder and Boulder County. The way that the arrangements are set up, we're really only contributing to the 128 underpass.
Mark, is the discussion with council, is that scheduled yet for council?
No, not yet.
Okay.
And you're not looking for any recommendation from the board to council about this, it sounds like.
Not at this point. Now, when we did the work back in 2016, I think there hasn't been a lot that's materially changed since then from staff perspective. It's just taken us a while to satisfy those conditions. And the IP was an attempt to bring folks up to speed on where we are. And certainly we wanted to make sure that the board saw that as well.
Okay. Karen, you had questions about the parking study?
Yeah. As the report itself says, this is a big task. And it looks like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different staff members in human dimensions have been involved, which it's not only a big task, it's a big staff commitment and a huge project. And I was surprised that it was submitted as an information item at the end of the packet, and I'm wondering if it could be discussed by the board at our February meeting.
Karen, so what we do is we schedule a directors team meeting the day after the board meetings. And the sole focus of that meeting is to go over what type of follow-up that we need to provide, but also mainly it's a chance to go over the future agendas. And so I will make note of this and we will discuss, and I'll need to check in with John and to see if that's a possibility. But I should get a quick response for you on that, just because tomorrow is the day that we do go over future agendas. And
Great.
I
love it.
I can see if that's a possibility.
And I still don't really understand what was tentatively scheduled for South Boulder Creek flood mitigation update in February, but it sounded from what John had to say like that might be postponed. But
Yeah, so when we meet with Kurt on a monthly basis to look ahead, we just kind of came up with an agreement that, hey, you know, at least every other month, we ought to sprinkle in South Boulder Creek because of the rolling nature of information that comes out and not knowing exactly when information comes available. So that's what we're doing. We're just sort of putting placeholders.
Update placeholder kind of thing.
And sometime there will be great information to bring forward, and sometimes there just won't be. And the way that it looks like now with upstream being delayed, and to council that March or February just may be a month that it's just not time to bring anything forward. But but we're monitoring it. We're in communication with utility staff pretty consistently. So.
Great. It could be a good time to look at the parking study results.
Yep.
And since that's a combined topic of South Boulder Creek, flood control, and CU South annexation, I'll just mention, maybe you all know that the city's questionnaire on CU South annexation is out now to the public if you haven't seen it. Any other items from the board? Seeing none, we're going to adjourn at 9 o'clock for the first time that I can ever remember. So unless there's anything else. Okay. Thank you to staff and also to the public that stayed up with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks,
We're
everybody.
adjourned.